All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling civic humanism. You might think you know what it is, but trust me, there's a lot more to uncover.
Oh, absolutely. It's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And yeah, often folks use it like it's the same thing as republicanism, but there are some important differences.
For sure, for sure. And to help us navigate this, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on civic humanism as our trusty guide. Speaking of which, they use this phrase, historiographical construct, which might sound a bit jargony. What's the deal with that?
Well, they're basically saying we shouldn't think of it as some kind of eternal, unchanging idea. Like how we understand civic humanism today, well, it's tied to looking at specific thinkers from a specific time and place. Think Italian Renaissance, especially in Florence.
So it's more like a lens, right? A
Yep.
way of looking at those thinkers and their ideas, but also realizing that our own historical perspective plays a role in how we understand them.
Exactly. And one thing that really sets these thinkers apart is their deep involvement in public life. They weren't just philosophers off in their own little world. They were actively engaged in shaping their city and its politics.
Right. And that active engagement, it was driven by values that were pretty different from what came before, right? Like contrasting with the medieval worldview.
Oh, huge contrast. The medieval world was all about hierarchy, religious authority, and the afterlife. But civic humanism, it emphasizes human agency, civic virtue, and shaping this worldly life.
Okay, so I'm already seeing some similarities with republicanism. Both emphasize being an active citizen and working for the common good, right?
Yeah, definitely some overlap there. But here's something that often gets missed. Civic humanism is super grounded in historical analysis, particularly of ancient Rome. They weren't just dreaming up theories, they were looking to the past for models of how to live and govern.
So they saw ancient Rome as a kind of, I don't know, a testing ground, a place to understand politics, virtue, and what makes a successful society.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Okay, now to really get this whole civic humanism thing, we've got to bring in Hans Baron and his famous Baron thesis.
Ah, yes. The historian who argued that Florentine civic humanism was basically born out of a crisis, Florence resisting Milanese expansionism in the early 1400s.
And what Barron saw was that this wasn't just some political event. It had a huge impact on their intellectual and cultural life. Like, it ignited this fusion of Petrarchan humanism with its focus on ancient wisdom and this fiery Florentine patriotism.
So you've got this love for Florence and a deep appreciation for classical learning, all mixed together in this really intense moment. Barron saw this as a turning point, right?
Absolutely a turning point.
Yeah.
And who embodies this fusion better than Leonardo Bruni, the Florentine chancellor, scholar, and prolific writer?
Bruni, the ultimate example of a civic scholar, someone putting those humanist ideals into practice while shaping Florentine politics. We'll definitely be coming back to him.
Now, both Barron and another big name, Eugenio Garin, they tended to see this close link between civic humanism and republicanism, almost like they were two sides of the same coin.
But didn't you say earlier that not all civic humanists were totally on board with the whole Republican model? Some had different ideas about what the ideal form of government should look like.
That's right, not all of them fit neatly into that box. It gets interesting when we start looking at those dissenting voices, but before we do that, let's dig a bit deeper into the common ground between civic humanism and republicanism. What are the core values that tie them together? So at the core of both, you've got this idea of civic virtue. It's this notion that citizens, they've got a duty to get involved, participate in public life, work for the common good.
So it's not just about me and my rights, but about recognizing my responsibility to the whole community.
Got it. Exactly. And they really believed that a healthy society, it needed engaged citizens, people who were willing to put the common good ahead of their own private interests. And that's where studying ancient Rome comes in, right? They were looking at these examples of civic virtue in action, both the successes and the failures.
Learning from history,
Huh.
trying to figure out how to cultivate those virtues that made Rome great while, avoiding the stuff that led to its downfall.
Right on. But remember, not all civic humanists were totally sold on this whole Republican model. Some had different ideas about the best way to create that virtuous and flourishing society.
Okay, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. So who were these civic humanist rebels? What were they pushing for? Spill the beans.
Well, let's start with John Pocock, another big name in the history of political thought. He had this fascinating interpretation of civic humanism as like a secular response to religious republicanism.
Oh, well, hold on a sec. Back up a bit. What exactly is this religious republicanism you're talking about?
Okay, so think about guys like John of Salisbury and Ptolemy of Lucca. They were writing back in the 13th and 14th centuries. They argued for a kind of republicanism that was rooted in Christian printer news.
So for them, the common good was tied to divine law, and political authority should ultimately serve God's will.
You got it. So Pocock argued that figures like Leonardo Bruni, they were using these classical ideas of virtue to tackle a very Christian problem, the problem of time.
Time. Okay, now I'm really curious. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, think about it. Christian thought, it emphasizes how temporary this earthly life is, right? It's fleeting. Our real focus should be on salvation and the afterlife. But classical thought, it often viewed time as cyclical, with these recurring patterns.
Hmm.
And you could achieve a kind of earthly immortality through great deeds and a lasting legacy.
Ah, I see. So these civic humanists, they were drawing on those classical ideas of virtue and fame to create meaning and purpose in a world that Christianity often portrayed as, well, kind of temporary and insignificant.
Exactly. They believed that by living a virtuous life and participating in public life, you could achieve this kind of earthly immortality, leaving a mark that goes beyond your own lifespan.
That's a pretty powerful idea. But I'm still thinking about those civic humanists who weren't convinced about republicanism. You mentioned Quentin Skinner earlier. What was his perspective?
Skinner, he was all about the Roman roots of civic humanism, but he argued that the main concern wasn't necessarily building a perfect republic. It was about freedom from domination, both from outside forces and from within.
So less about the perfect system of government and more about making sure individuals and communities could live free from tyranny, whether it came from foreign powers or oppressive rulers at home.
Right. It was a practical response to the very real dangers that Italian city-states faced back then. A world of powerful monarchs and ambitious neighbors. Active citizenship. It wasn't just about personal fulfillment. It was about protection, about safeguarding yourself and your community from those who might want to control you.
And, that's a perspective that still resonates today with all the challenges we're seeing to democracy and individual rights around the world.
For sure, for sure. And it really highlights how civic humanism wasn't some kind of unified movement with one rigid ideology. There was a real diversity of thought within this tradition, different ways of understanding those core values and how to apply them to the messiness of politics.
Speaking of different interpretations, you mentioned James Hankins and his take on virtue politics. What's his angle on all this?
So Hankins argues that for these thinkers, the key to a flourishing commonwealth, it wasn't about having one specific type of government. It was more about the character of the people in charge.
So it's not about democracy versus monarchy. It's about making sure that the leaders, whoever they are wise, just, and committed to the common good.
Exactly. This really challenges that idea that every civic humanist was automatically a hardcore Republican. Their main focus was on the moral foundation of the state, not the specific form it took.
Okay. All this talk about virtuous leaders and flourishing societies, it's making me really want to get to know some of these civic humanist all-stars. And hey, lucky for us, our deep dive is about to introduce us to a few of the big names and their key ideas. Okay, let's meet these civic humanist all-stars. Let's start with Leonardo Bruni, the civic scholar we talked about earlier.
Bruni, he's a perfect example of how these humanist ideals could actually be put into practice. He wasn't just reading about the classics. He was actively involved in Florentine politics as chancellor.
And his writings really show that blend of humanist learning and real-world experience.
Oh, absolutely. Take his Laudatio and Panegyric, for instance. They're basically love letters to Florence, celebrating its accomplishments and unique spirit.
But it's more than just civic pride, right? Bruni's making a point about the connection between Florence's success and its republican system.
Exactly. He highlights liberty, equality, and just laws as the foundation of Florentine greatness. He's not just describing a city, he's holding it up as a model for others.
It's like he's saying, look, I've studied the ancients, I've served the republic, and this is what works.
He's definitely a strong advocate for republicanism. But now, let's shift gears a bit and look at Coluccio Salutati, Bruni's predecessor as chancellor. We mentioned before how he had some interesting views on tyranny.
Yeah, that really piqued my curiosity. How could a humanist, so immersed in republican ideals, defend certain types of tyrants?
Well, in his work De Tyranno, Salutati makes this distinction between usurpers, those who seize power illegitimately, and rulers who might become tyrannical even if they came to power legitimately. He's not saying tyranny is a good thing, but he's wrestling with how to respond to it.
So it's not about the label tyrant itself, but about where their authority comes from and how they use it.
Precisely. And for Salutati, the big question is whether private citizens are ever justified in killing a tyrant, even a legitimate ruler who's become oppressive.
And what's his take on that?
He argues that only the public authority that put the ruler in power has the right to remove him, not individuals acting on their own.
So he's putting the rule of law and stability of a state above individual acts of resistance, even against a tyrannical leader.
Right, he's worried about the chaos and instability that could happen if people start taking justice into their own hands. And get this, he even defends Julius Caesar, suggesting that sometimes, in those really turbulent times, you need strong leadership, even if it looks tyrannical.
Wow, that's a bold statement coming from a humanist steeped in Republican ideals.
Yeah.
It really shows how civic humanism wasn't some rigid, one-size-fits-all ideology. There was room for different interpretations and applications of those core values.
Absolutely. Now let's meet another Florentine humanist who really shakes things up, Aurelio Lippo Brandolini. He actually argues for the superiority of monarchy.
Wait, a humanist arguing against republicanism? This is getting good.
Brandolini is a skilled rhetorician. In his De Comparatione Republicae Regni, he takes all those typical arguments in favor of republics and uses humanist reasoning to pick them apart.
So he's using their own tools against them. What's his main critique of republicanism?
He points to the dangers of factionalism, those divisions and power struggles that can tear a republic apart. He says a wise and just monarch can provide the stability and unity that republics often lack.
And to really drive his point home, he offers a different perspective on Roman history, suggesting that the kings, not the republic, were the ones who brought peace and prosperity.
You got it. He's challenging those narratives that people like Bruni were promoting, forcing us to rethink our assumptions about which systems of government are best for achieving those humanist goals of justice, order, and a flourishing society.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've gone from Republican champions to defenders of legitimate tyranny to outright supporters of monarchy, and all within the framework of civic humanism.
And it gets even broader. Let's bring in Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a super accomplished humanist who actually became Pope Pius II.
Wait, a humanist pope? You said he advocated for a universal empire. That doesn't sound very humanist or Republican.
It might seem contradictory, but remember, civic humanism isn't tied to just one political ideology. In his De Ortu et Auctoritate Imperii Romani, Piccolomini starts with a familiar humanist idea. Kings were initially chosen to protect the weak, but then he takes it in a surprising direction.
I'm listening. What's the twist?
He says having multiple kings will inevitably lead to conflict and war, which defeats the whole purpose of having kings in the first place. His solution: a single world empire led by a virtuous ruler to bring about true justice and universal harmony.
So he's going even further than Brandolini, who was advocating for a single kingdom. Piccolomini wants to take it global. This really stretches our understanding of civic humanism, showing how those core values could even be used to justify imperial ambitions.
It all boils down to how you interpret and apply those core principles to the challenges of your time. And speaking of challenging assumptions, we can't wrap up this civic humanism journey without talking about Niccolò Machiavelli.
Ah, yes. Machiavelli, the ultimate political pragmatist. He's famous for The Prince, with its advice on getting and keeping power, but he also explored republicanism in the discourses. It's like he embodies both sides of a civic humanist coin.
And just like many of the thinkers we've talked about, Machiavelli was really interested in the problem of conflict, especially clashes between different social groups. He saw this tension as a fundamental challenge for any society.
Right. Whether it's Bruni talking about class harmony in Florence, or Salutati worried about uprisings against tyrants, or even Piccolomini envisioning a world empire to end all wars, they all saw conflict as something that needed to be dealt with, and each had their own way of managing it.
Exactly. And with Machiavelli, this focus on managing conflict takes center stage. Both the Prince and the discourses acknowledge the tension between the grandi, the nobles, and the popolo, the common people. How do you create a stable and thriving state when you have this inherent power struggle going on?
That's a question we're still grappling with today, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we balance competing interests and build a society where everyone can flourish?
For sure. Now, in The Prince, Machiavelli seems to give pretty straightforward advice. If you're a ruler, side with the people, control the nobles, and don't be afraid to use any means necessary to maintain order.
That's the Machiavelli everyone thinks they know. Ruthless, pragmatic, the ends justify the means. But you're saying there's more to it than that?
There is, because in the discourses, he really dives deep into the Roman Republic. And here's the twist. That conflict between the nobles and the people, it wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
Wait, he's saying that constant struggle was actually a good thing.
In the context of the Roman Republic, yeah. Machiavelli argued that this tension, this push and pull between different groups, was actually the source of their liberty and their strength.
So it's like a system of checks and balances, but instead of being written down in a constitution, it's driven by this underlying social conflict.
Precisely. Machiavelli argued that this back and forth, this constant negotiation and struggle, prevented any one group from becoming too powerful and made sure that people's voices were heard. It was messy, but it led to a dynamic and ultimately successful republic.
That's a pretty radical idea, that this conflict, which we usually see as a negative thing, could actually be the driving force behind liberty and progress.
It's a crucial insight. And Machiavelli even argues that the Roman Republic's ability to channel that internal conflict outward through conquest and expansion was a sign of its strength and vitality. It's like he's saying, if you can't get rid of conflict, redirect it. Make it a force that pushes your society forward.
That's a powerful idea, and to be honest, a bit unsettling. It really makes you think about how we deal with conflict today, both within our own societies and on the global stage.
Absolutely. It highlights the complex legacy of Machiavelli, a thinker who continues to challenge and provoke us centuries later.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into civic humanism. We started with a simple definition, but clearly it's so much more than that.
It's not just a single ideology or a rule book for government. It's a way of thinking about power, citizenship, and the common good. And as we've seen, there's room for a wide range of perspectives within that framework.
And it's amazing how relevant these ideas still are today. These concerns about civic virtue, managing conflict, and creating a flourishing society, they matter just as much now as they did in Renaissance Italy.
The specific solutions these thinkers came up with might not always apply to our modern world, but the questions they were asking, those are timeless. How do we balance individual freedom with the needs of the community? How do we build a just and stable society when everyone has different interests? How do we ensure that those in power are wise and virtuous? These are enduring questions of political life, and civic humanism gives us a rich tradition for thinking about them.
So, as you continue exploring these ideas, keep those questions in mind. If civic humanism could hold such diverse views, from passionate Republicans to those who favored monarchy or even empire, what does that tell us about how complex political ideals really are? How do we apply those ideals in a world that's constantly changing?
Indeed. Maybe the biggest takeaway from civic humanism is that there are no easy answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions. It's a call to engage with the complexities of our world, to strive for virtue in our own lives, and to never stop questioning the assumptions that shape our political systems.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into civic humanism. And until next time, keep those drains working and keep exploring the world of ideas.